In the heart of Blackwood Forest, where sunlight barely penetrates the ancient canopy, Detective Sarah Chen knelt beside an object that made her blood run cold. The porcelain doll sat perfectly upright against a moss-covered stump, its glassy eyes reflecting the filtered light like twin mirrors. Sarah had seen missing person cases before, but never anything quite like this. The doll's face paint was cracked and faded, creating an unsettling pattern that resembled tears, while its permanent smile seemed to mock her presence. She photographed the scene carefully, knowing this would become crucial evidence. The doll wore what appeared to be a miniature Victorian dress, now stained and torn, and its tiny porcelain hands were positioned as if reaching towards something just beyond the clearing. Sarah's radio crackled with static as she called for backup, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. The forest seemed to hold its breath around her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't just a lost toy, but something far more sinister. As she waited for her team to arrive, Sarah noticed strange symbols carved into the tree stump behind the doll, symbols that hadn't been there moments before. 3 days earlier, Emma Richardson had been walking home from her evening shift at the diner when she took a wrong turn into Blackwood Forest. What started as a shortcut became a nightmare as the familiar paths twisted and turned into something alien. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches forming a natural prison that disoriented her completely. Emma's white uniform dress was now torn and dirty, her feet bare and scraped from hours of wandering. She stood frozen in a moonlit clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard something that made her blood freeze. A child's laughter echoed through the trees, but there was no child in sight. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the ancient trunks in a mocking melody. Emma's breath came in short gasps as she tried to retrace her steps, but every direction looked the same. The moonlight cast eerie shadows that danced at the edge of her vision, and she could swear she saw a figure watching her from behind the trees. Her phone had died hours ago, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. As the laughter grew closer, Emma noticed a strange stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Detective Chen studied the doll through her magnifying glass, cataloging every minute detail that might provide clues about Emma's disappearance. The craftsmanship was extraordinary for something that appeared to be decades old, yet there was something deeply wrong about it. The face paint, once bright blues and pinks, had faded to ghostly remnants that barely clung to the porcelain surface. Cracks spread across the doll's face like a spider's web, each fracture revealing layers of history and neglect. Chen noticed that the doll's glassy blue eyes seemed to reflect the forest canopy with startling clarity, as if they were real eyes that had witnessed everything. The tiny sharp teeth visible in its permanent smile were particularly unsettling, far too detailed for a simple child's toy. She photographed the doll from every angle, noting the way dirt and age stains created patterns that almost looked intentional. The doll's clothing, though miniature, showed remarkable attention to detail with tiny buttons and stitching that suggested it had been handmade by someone with considerable skill. Chen's partner approached with the preliminary analysis, his face grim as he reported that the symbols carved into the tree stump matched nothing in their database. The doll seemed to stare back at them through the camera lens, its expression unchanged yet somehow more menacing with each passing moment. Emma pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her heart thundering so loudly she was sure whatever was following her could hear it. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that felt far more threatening. Her torn dress clung to her sweat-drenched skin, and her bare feet were cut and bleeding from hours of desperate wandering. She had been walking for what felt like days, but the forest never changed, never offered an exit. Every path led to another identical grove of twisted trees, and every clearing contained the same mocking stillness. Emma's hands trembled as she covered her mouth to prevent any sound from escaping, though she wasn't sure what she was hiding from anymore. The forest seemed alive in ways that defied logic, with shadows that moved independently of their sources and whispers that seemed to come from inside her own head. She had seen things that couldn't possibly exist, shapes that flickered at the edge of her vision and faces that appeared in the bark of trees. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, a constant presence that followed her every step. Emma dared to peek around the tree trunk, and her blood turned to ice. In the distance, barely visible through the moon-dappled shadows, the porcelain doll sat waiting on its familiar stump, its glassy eyes fixed in her direction. But she wasn't alone anymore. Dark figures moved between the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct, yet somehow more real than anything else in this nightmare forest. The doll's eyes held secrets that Detective Chen couldn't quite decipher, even under magnification. Each glassy orb reflected the forest scene with startling clarity, showing tree branches and filtered moonlight in perfect miniature. Chen had seen many dolls in her years of investigating missing persons cases, but none possessed this level of unsettling realism. The eyes seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them, catching light in ways that suggested movement where there should be none. She photographed the reflections carefully, hoping that analysis might reveal something about the doll's origins or how long it had been sitting in that clearing. The left eye showed a clearer reflection of the surrounding trees, while the right seemed to capture something different, almost as if it had been positioned to watch a different direction entirely. Chen noticed tiny imperfections in the glass that created prismatic effects, breaking the reflected light into rainbow fragments that danced across the doll's porcelain cheeks. The craftsmanship was too precise for a mass-produced toy, suggesting either exceptional skill or something far more disturbing. As she worked, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was somehow aware of her scrutiny, that those empty eyes were actually seeing everything she did. The reflection in the left eye seemed to shift again, and for just a moment, she thought she saw Emma's frightened face staring back at her from the glassy depths. Emma's scream died in her throat as she realized she was completely surrounded. The shadowy figures had emerged from between the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct yet somehow more present than anything else in the clearing. They stood in perfect stillness, facing her with an attention that made her skin crawl. Their features seemed to blur and shift when she looked directly at them, but in her peripheral vision, she could see that they were all watching her with an intensity that suggested hunger. The moonlight cast pale illumination across the scene, turning everything ghostly white and creating stark shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Emma's torn dress fluttered in a breeze that shouldn't have existed, the fabric darkened with stains she didn't want to examine too closely. Her bare feet were rooted to the spot, unable to move despite every instinct screaming at her to run. In the center of the clearing, the porcelain doll sat waiting on its stump, its permanent smile now seeming almost triumphant. The doll's glassy eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that made it appear to glow with inner light, and Emma couldn't help but notice that all the shadowy figures seemed to be looking toward it as well. There was something ritualistic about the arrangement, as if this was a scene that had played out before and would play out again. The silence was absolute, broken only by Emma's ragged breathing and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She felt like prey in a hunt, and the hunters were patient beyond human comprehension. Back at the station, Detective Chen subjected the doll to every forensic test available, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. The doll had been processed for fingerprints, DNA, and any trace evidence that might lead to Emma, yet every result came back inconclusive. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the laboratory, the doll's cracked face paint revealed even more disturbing details. Chen used specialized equipment to examine manufacturing marks that suggested the doll was far older than its apparent condition indicated. The porcelain showed signs of craftsmanship that predated modern mass production techniques, yet the materials analysis suggested it was created within the last 50 years. The doll's glassy eyes continued to reflect their surroundings with unsettling accuracy, now showing the sterile environment of the police station with the same clarity they had shown the forest clearing. Chen noticed that the doll's clothing contained fibers that didn't match any known textile manufacturers, and the tiny buttons were made of a material that the lab couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all were the symbols carved into the doll's back, symbols that had somehow gone unnoticed during the initial field examination. They seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, almost as if they were trying to communicate something that defied translation. Chen's partner brought her coffee, but she barely noticed, completely absorbed in trying to understand what they had found. The doll sat motionless on the examination table, yet somehow it felt like it was watching every moment of the investigation with patient interest. Emma's desperation finally overcame her terror as she took a hesitant step toward the porcelain doll. Something deep in her mind whispered that the doll was the key to escaping this nightmare, that reaching it would somehow break whatever spell held her trapped in this endless forest. Her bare feet moved across the moss-covered ground with trembling steps, each one sending ripples of fear through her body. The torn white dress fluttered around her like a ghostly shroud, and her long brown hair fell across her face as she focused entirely on the doll's unmoving form. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting an eerie glow that made everything seem surreal and dreamlike. The doll's twisted smile seemed to widen as she approached, its glassy eyes reflecting her frightened face with perfect clarity. Emma's hands shook as she reached out, fingers stretching toward the porcelain figure with the hope that touching it would free her from whatever force had drawn her into this place. Behind her, the shadowy figures remained perfectly still, their indistinct forms watching with an attention that felt both predatory and expectant. The forest held its breath around her, and even the wind seemed to pause as if waiting for her next move. Emma's lips moved in silent prayer as her fingers neared the doll's porcelain surface, and for just a moment, she thought she saw the doll's head tilt slightly in her direction. The symbols carved into the tree stump behind the doll seemed to pulse with a faint light that matched her racing heartbeat, and Emma realized with growing horror that she might be walking into something far worse than simple escape. As Emma's fingers neared the doll, something impossible happened. The porcelain hand moved. Detective Chen would later question whether she had imagined it, but in that moment, she was certain she had seen the doll's tiny fingers extend slightly toward Emma's outstretched hand. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried implications that shattered every rational explanation she could form. The doll's cracked face paint seemed to shift with the movement, the twisted smile becoming something more knowing, more satisfied. Its glassy blue eyes continued to reflect Emma's frightened face with perfect clarity, yet now there seemed to be something else in that reflection, something that suggested the doll was seeing far more than its immediate surroundings. Chen studied the doll's hand under magnification, searching for any evidence of the movement she had witnessed. The porcelain fingers were individually crafted with remarkable detail, each tiny nail painted with precision that suggested human artistry rather than machine production. Age stains and surface imperfections created patterns that almost looked intentional, as if the doll had been designed to appear ancient despite its relatively recent creation. The hand itself showed no signs of mechanical components or hidden mechanisms that might explain movement, yet Chen couldn't dismiss what she had seen. She photographed the hand from every angle, cataloging every minute detail that might provide clues about its construction. The doll sat motionless now, as if it had never moved at all, yet Chen couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow aware of her scrutiny. The laboratory lights cast harsh shadows across the porcelain surface, highlighting every crack and imperfection while somehow making the doll appear even more lifelike than before. Emma's fingertips made contact with the doll's porcelain fingers, and the world exploded into sensation. The doll's surface was neither warm nor cold, but somehow alive with an energy that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she felt connected to something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting in this clearing for reasons she couldn't comprehend. The doll's glassy eyes began to glow with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat, and Emma realized with growing horror that she was no longer looking at a reflection in those orbs, but something looking back at her from impossible depths. The shadowy figures around the clearing leaned forward with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken, their indistinct forms becoming somehow more present, more real than the trees that surrounded them. Emma's hand trembled against the doll's fingers, and she felt something pass between them, some essence that left her feeling hollow and drained. The moonlight seemed to focus entirely on their point of contact, creating an ethereal spotlight that illuminated the scene with otherworldly clarity. Ancient trees creaked around them, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers clawing at the heavens. Emma's frightened face showed the moment of connection with startling clarity, her eyes wide with terror and wonder as she realized she had touched something that should not exist. The doll's twisted smile seemed to widen impossibly, and Emma felt her own lips moving in response to a compulsion she couldn't resist. Detective Chen found herself unable to look away from the doll as it sat on the examination table, its glassy eyes seeming to track her every movement with patient interest. The laboratory lighting cast harsh shadows across the porcelain face, emphasizing the cracks in the faded paint and highlighting the doll's permanent smile with unsettling clarity. Chen had been working late, reviewing evidence from Emma's case, when she first noticed that the doll appeared to have shifted position slightly. It was subtle, barely perceptible, yet somehow the doll now faced her directly instead of the angle it had occupied when she left it hours earlier. The symbols carved into the doll's back seemed to glow with a faint light that pulsed in rhythm with the fluorescent lights above, though Chen told herself it was just a trick of reflection and shadow. She had seen enough strange things in her career to know when to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that this doll was somehow aware of her presence. The doll's clothing showed no signs of disturbance, yet Chen was certain she had positioned it differently during her earlier examination. She photographed the doll from multiple angles, documenting what she hoped was just her imagination playing tricks, but the evidence suggested something far more disturbing. The doll's eyes continued to reflect the laboratory environment with perfect accuracy, yet now they seemed to show more than just the immediate surroundings. Chen noticed her own reflection in those glassy depths, but there seemed to be something else there as well, something that watched her with an attention that felt almost predatory. The silence of the empty laboratory seemed to press down around her, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of her own breathing. She told herself to call for backup, to get someone else in the room, but her feet felt rooted to the spot as if the doll's attention had somehow anchored her in place. The transformation began slowly, almost gently, as if the forest itself was welcoming Emma into its ancient embrace. Her long brown hair seemed to flow and shift, becoming something more permanent, more fixed in its arrangement. The terrified expression on her face gradually smoothed into the doll's characteristic twisted smile, the fear draining away to be replaced by something that looked almost peaceful. Emma's glassy blue eyes began to reflect the forest canopy with the same clarity the original doll had shown, and Chen realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the completion of some terrible cycle. The torn white dress transformed into the doll's detailed Victorian clothing, the fabric shifting and changing until it matched the miniature garments with perfect precision. Emma's bare feet became porcelain, then her legs, then her entire body as the transformation worked its way upward. The shadowy figures around the clearing watched with satisfied attention, their indistinct forms becoming somehow more substantial as the process continued. Moonlight illuminated the scene with an ethereal glow that made everything seem both beautiful and terrible at the same time. Emma's hands became tiny porcelain fingers, perfectly crafted and painted with the same attention to detail that marked the original doll. Her face completed its transformation last, the cracks appearing in her face paint as if they had always been there, waiting to emerge. The symbols carved into the tree stump behind her began to fade, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. When the transformation was complete, two identical dolls sat on the stump, their glassy eyes reflecting the forest scene with perfect clarity. The shadowy figures began to fade back into the trees, their satisfied attention shifting to other matters. The forest released its breath in a sigh that rustled the leaves, and the clearing returned to its eternal stillness, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its embrace. Chen followed the trail deeper into Blackwood Forest, her flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with a narrow beam that seemed insufficient against the vast shadows of the ancient trees. The symbols carved into the doll's back had matched something in an old case file, leading her to this particular clearing where local folklore spoke of disappearances that occurred in cycles. As her light swept across the moss-covered ground, she froze. On the familiar tree stump sat not one, but two identical porcelain dolls, their cracked faces turned toward her with expressions that seemed to anticipate her arrival. The flashlight beam illuminated the scene with stark shadows that made the dolls appear even more lifelike, their glassy blue eyes reflecting the artificial light with perfect clarity. Chen's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. Both dolls wore the same twisted smiles, their face paint cracked in identical patterns that resembled tears frozen in time. The Victorian clothing was identical in every detail, right down to the tiny buttons that she had been unable to identify in the laboratory. Ancient trees surrounded the clearing with twisted branches that seemed to reach toward the scene with almost conscious intent. Chen's radio crackled with static from her partner checking in, but she couldn't bring herself to respond immediately. The dolls sat in perfect stillness, yet somehow she felt their attention focused entirely on her presence. The symbols that had been carved into the tree stump were visible again, now glowing with a faint light that seemed to pulse in response to her heartbeat. Chen knew with absolute certainty that she was standing in the center of something far older and more dangerous than any missing person case she had ever investigated. The flashlight beam seemed to dim slightly, as if the clearing itself was absorbing the light, and Chen realized that she might have just become part of the same cycle that had claimed Emma Richardson. Both dolls continued to watch her with patient interest, their glassy eyes reflecting not just her flashlight beam, but something far more ominous from the depths of the forest beyond.